There is a piece of paper sitting in an archive in Washington right now that most Jamaicans have never seen, and it decided the fate of your island before your grandparents were born. It gave away Jamaican land for 99 years. It was signed by 2 foreign governments, in 2 foreign capitals, and not a single Jamaican was in the room. Not one Jamaican signature. Not one Jamaican vote. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. It is happening again, right now. With different paperwork, a different language, and a different flag, but the same basic transaction. A small island, enormous strategic value, and great powers deciding what to do with it, often without asking the people who actually live there. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why Jamaica keeps appearing on the desk of every major power on Earth, decade after decade, war after war, and why that pattern has never once broken. Not during the Second World War, not during the Cold War. Not now, in a moment when China and the United States are competing for global position in almost exactly the way Britain and America once competed for Jamaica itself. If you are Jamaican, in Kingston or in London, in Toronto or in New York, this is not abstract history. This is the reason your remittance rates move the way they do, the reason certain roads got built and others did not, the reason your government's foreign policy options are more limited than they should be for a country with this much value. Stay with me, because we are starting with the deal nobody teaches you about, and it is more consequential than almost anything in Jamaica's modern history. September of 1940. Europe is on fire. Nazi Germany has taken Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark in less than 12 months, and the Luftwaffe is bombing British cities every single night. Winston Churchill is not just worried, he is desperate. The convoys keeping Britain fed and armed are being torn apart by German submarines hunting the Atlantic in coordinated packs, and Britain's navy does not have enough ships to stop them. 50 old American destroyers sit in reserve, aging but seaworthy. Exactly what Britain needs to escort those convoys and hunt the submarines, threatening to starve an island nation into surrender. The problem is that the United States is not at war. American law will not allow a direct transfer of warships to a foreign belligerent, and Congress has no appetite for entering someone else's fight, so President Roosevelt finds another way in. On September the 2nd, 1940, the United States and Britain signed what history now calls the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. Britain gets 50 destroyers to keep its lifeline open. In exchange, the United States receives 99-year lease rights to build military bases across 8 British territories: Bermuda, Newfoundland, Trinidad, British Guiana, the Bahamas, Antigua, St. Lucia, and Jamaica. Read that list again. 99 years of American military access, and Jamaica is on it, and Jamaica had no seat at that table. This was not negotiated in Kingston. It was negotiated in Washington and in London by 2 governments managing a global emergency, and Jamaica's geography was simply an item on the ledger. The island was a British colony, which meant its land belonged to its colonizer to trade away, and that is precisely what happened. This is what it looks like when your position on the map is worth more to the world than your voice in the room. Within months, American engineers and thousands of workers arrive on Jamaican soil. In Kingston Harbour, on a small landmass called Little Goat Island, they build a seaplane base. American PBY Catalina aircraft, long-range patrol bombers built for hunting submarines, start flying daily missions out of that base, sweeping thousands of miles of Caribbean water. And they are not doing this for practice. The Caribbean in 1942 is not calm water. It is a killing field. In February of that year, Germany launches Operation Neuland, an offensive across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico that catches Allied commanders completely off guard. Dozens of oil tankers and cargo vessels go to the bottom of the ocean in a matter of weeks. Historians studying this period describe ship losses in these waters as catastrophic, at moments rivaling the destruction happening in the North Atlantic, but concentrated into a much smaller stretch of sea. This is the environment Jamaica finds itself inside. And here is the detail almost nobody outside specialist circles ever mentions: bauxite, the reddish ore that comes out of Jamaica's hills, the raw material that becomes aluminium once refined. In the 1940s, aluminium is not something you find in a kitchen drawer. It is a war material. It is the frame of every fighter aircraft, the housing of every engine component, the literal skeleton of the planes the Allies are racing to build faster than the Axis powers can shoot them down. No steady bauxite supply means slower aluminium production. Slower aluminium production means aircraft manufacturing stalls. And aircraft manufacturing stalling, in a war being decided in the skies over Europe, is a losing proposition. Jamaica was one of the primary sources of Allied bauxite during this period. Not a symbolic contribution, an industrial lifeline. Further inland near Maypen in Clarendon Parish, the Americans build Vernam Field, a major airbase functioning as a regional coordination hub. Thousands of American military personnel are stationed across the island, operating under their own chain of command, on land where they hold no formal sovereignty at all. This is the blunt truth of what strategic geography looks like when the nation sitting on it does not control its own destiny. Your land becomes someone else's asset. Your position on the map becomes someone else's advantage. So why Jamaica specifically? Out of every Caribbean island Britain could have offered, why does this one keep showing up in the calculations of empires for 5 centuries? The answer is a stretch of water that almost nobody outside naval strategy circles ever discusses, and it sits right next to Jamaica's northeastern coast, the Windward Passage. Roughly 80 kilometers of open sea separate the eastern tip of Cuba from the northwestern coast of Hispaniola. That gap is the Windward Passage, and it connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean Sea, and from there through the Panama Canal all the way to the Pacific. Every ship moving from the eastern United States, from Western Europe, from the Mediterranean toward the Panama Canal, passes through or near this single corridor. The Panama Canal alone handles somewhere between 5 and 6% of all global maritime trade every single year, hundreds of billions of dollars of cargo, and the Windward Passage is one of the main arteries feeding ships toward it. Whoever can monitor this passage sees nearly everything that matters moving through this hemisphere. In wartime, that kind of intelligence is priceless. In peacetime, it is still worth an enormous amount to any nation tracking trade routes, naval movement, or regional security threats. Jamaica sits directly at the western approach to that passage. It is the watchtower, the observation post that no satellite, no drone, no piece of modern technology can fully replace, because geography itself cannot be moved, cannot be rebuilt somewhere more convenient, cannot be negotiated away in a boardroom. This is why the world's most powerful nations have never been able to look away from this island. Not sentiment, not history, geometry. And geometry does not expire. Now fast forward. Past the end of the Second World War, past Jamaican independence in August of 1962, into one of the most dramatic and most under-discussed chapters in the island's modern story, a chapter that pulled newly independent Jamaica straight into the middle of the Cold War and left scars in Kingston that are still visible today. By 1972, Jamaica is barely a decade into independence, and the Cold War is at its most dangerous point. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a planet-wide contest, and since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the Caribbean has become the single most sensitive region in that entire contest. You have to understand what happened in October 1962 to understand everything that follows. American U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet nuclear missile installations under construction in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world stands closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. Jamaica, barely 4 months old as an independent nation, watches this entire crisis unfold in its own backyard. The resolution of that crisis does not calm American nerves. It hardens them into an obsession. There must never be another Cuba. From 1962 onward, every election in every Caribbean nation is watched, analyzed, and assessed from Washington for ideological drift. Into that atmosphere walks Michael Manley. In 1972, Manley wins the Jamaican general election, and he is one of the most compelling political figures this region has ever produced. Charismatic, intellectually formidable, committed to democratic socialism, and openly unwilling to let Jamaica function as an American satellite while its resources are extracted and its workers stay poor. He does not just talk about this. He acts on it immediately. Manley builds a close personal relationship with Fidel Castro. Cuban doctors, teachers, and technical advisors begin arriving in Jamaica, and Manley welcomes them publicly, without apology. He levies a production tax on the bauxite industry, sharply increasing what American and Canadian mining corporations must pay to extract Jamaica's own natural resources. He stands at the United Nations and argues for a new international economic order, directly challenging the architecture of Western economic dominance. He calls himself a son of the Third World, and he means it. To poor Jamaicans, he is a champion. To Washington, he is an emergency. The response does not arrive as a diplomatic cable. It arrives as an operation. Declassified CIA records confirm that American intelligence actively worked to destabilize the Manly government. Economic pressure moves through deniable channels. International lending institutions quietly discourage favorable terms. Business investment dries up almost overnight. International press coverage amplifies stories of shortages, crime, and chaos, feeding a narrative that Manly's Jamaica is falling apart. And then there are the guns. Documented evidence, gathered by investigative journalists and confirmed in declassified records, shows that weapons were deliberately channeled into Jamaica's garrison communities during this period. The firearms ending up in the hands of political enforcers in West Kingston are not all coming from local sources. External hands are involved, and the logic behind it is brutal in its simplicity. Make Jamaica ungovernable under Manly, let the population associate his government with fear and bloodshed, and they will remove him themselves at the ballot box. By 1980, it works. That year's general election becomes one of the most violent political events in the modern history of this hemisphere, with hundreds of people killed in the months leading up to polling day. The island is traumatized. When the votes are finally counted, Edward Seaga and the Jamaica Labour Party win in a landslide, and Manly is swept from power. What happens next tells you everything. Seaga travels to Washington and becomes one of the very first foreign leaders to meet Ronald Reagan after his January 1981 inauguration. That single visit sends a message to every government in the Caribbean. Jamaica has returned to the Western camp. Reagan calls Jamaica a beacon of democracy and holds Seaga up as living proof that choosing Washington pays. In 1983, Reagan launches the Caribbean Basin Initiative, folding Caribbean economies into the American economic orbit through preferential trade access and accelerated aid, with Jamaica positioned as the model nation. IMF arrangements that were adversarial under Manly suddenly become cooperative. American investment flows back in. Jamaica is rewarded deliberately and visibly because the reward is itself the message aimed at every other Caribbean capital watching closely. Here is the insight that cuts through all of it. It does not matter whether Michael Manley or Edward Seaga sits in Jamaica House. It does not matter whether the government leans socialist or conservative, toward Havana or toward Washington. The American strategic interest in Jamaica never actually changes. Only the method changes. Under Manley, pressure is the tool used to bring Jamaica back into line. Under Seaga, investment is the tool used to keep it there. Different instruments, same objective, because the Windward Passage still demands it, the Panama Canal still demands it, and the underlying geography of global trade has not shifted an inch. Great powers do not walk away from small nations with this much strategic value. They simply rotate their tools. And right now, a new power has walked through that same door, carrying instruments nobody in Washington fully anticipated. If this story is landing the way it should, this is genuinely the moment to hit subscribe. Caribbean Journey is building toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins right now is helping get this channel, and stories like this one, in front of more people who need to hear them. It costs nothing and it means everything to a channel this size. Tap subscribe and let's keep going, because what comes next is the chapter Washington is losing sleep over. In 2005, a company called China Harbour Engineering Company arrives in Jamaica. It is a subsidiary of China Communications Construction Company, one of the largest infrastructure conglomerates on the planet, and it wins a contract to help build Highway 2000, a modern expressway designed to cut travel time across the island dramatically. The work is genuinely impressive. The terms are genuinely favorable. Within a few years, a highway cuts through Jamaican terrain in a way the island had never experienced before. Washington notices immediately, and it does not file this under routine commerce. China Harbour Engineering Company is not a private firm in the way a Western construction company is private. It is a state enterprise, and inside China's system of governance, the line between corporate interest and national interest simply does not function the way it does in America or Britain. When a Chinese state-owned company wins the contract to build critical infrastructure inside a strategically located Caribbean nation, American strategic planners file that under competition, not commerce, and the investment keeps arriving. A Chinese firm builds a major section of the North-South Highway, connecting Kingston on the southern coast directly to Jamaica's northern communities and ports. cutting straight through mountainous interior that Jamaicans had discussed connecting for generations without ever finding the financings to do it. China offers the financing. China builds the road. Chinese arranged loans underwrite the entire project. Jamaica signs onto China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013 and now spanning more than 100 nations, the most ambitious infrastructure program in human history. Its stated purpose is global development and connectivity. Its strategic architecture, as understood widely across the international relations community, is the systematic extension of Chinese economic relationships and influence across the developing world on a timescale measured in generations, not news cycles. For Jamaica, the Belt and Road delivers something tangible. Roads that actually get built, highways through mountains, visible development that a government can point to and say, "Look what we accomplished." But every loan is also a relationship, and when the lender is a state as strategically deliberate as China, and the borrower sits on geography as valuable as Jamaica's, that relationship carries weight beyond the commercial terms on the page. The clearest warning of where this can lead comes from Sri Lanka. That country borrowed heavily from Chinese state lenders to build a major port at Hambantota on its southern coast, betting that the port itself would eventually generate enough shipping traffic and revenue to justify the debt. It did not work out that way. The port struggled to attract the volume of traffic its planners had projected, the debt kept compounding, and by 2017 Sri Lanka's government found itself with very few options left on the table. Sri Lanka agreed that year to lease the port and its surrounding land to a Chinese company for 99 years in exchange for debt relief. 99 years. The exact same duration as the base leases the United States secured from Britain back in 1940. Different century, different players. The identical strategic logic underneath it. A strategically located piece of coastline changing hands for the better part of a century, decided by a balance sheet rather than a ballot. This is not a claim that Jamaica is on an identical path. It is a reminder that debt, once it grows large enough relative to an economy's size, stops being purely a financial question and starts becoming a sovereignty question, and that transition can happen quietly, one refinancing agreement at a time, long before anyone announces it publicly. Jamaica's own debt situation is complex and well documented. For years, the country has carried one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios anywhere in the world, operating under IMF structural adjustment programs that demand painful fiscal discipline. Into that environment, Chinese infrastructure financing offers something genuinely attractive on the surface, but attractive terms at the signing table and manageable terms decades later are not always the same thing. To be fair, critics of this framing make a valid point. Western financial institutions have their own long history of attaching political conditions to investment and aid, and IMF structural adjustment requirements have shaped Jamaican policy just as forcefully as any Chinese loan condition ever could. That argument has real merit, and it actually points toward the most useful way to understand Jamaica's position today. Neither power engages this island without strategic motivation. Neither offers support without an expectation of return. The real question was never which foreign power is more benevolent. The real question is whether Jamaica can navigate relationships with both in a way that maximizes what Jamaica gets and minimizes what Jamaica owes. Because Jamaica's leverage lies precisely in the space between two competing interests, and right now that space is real and it is growing. Now here is where the stakes become impossible to ignore. Kingston Harbour is one of the largest natural harbours anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and the Port of Kingston functions as the primary transshipment hub for the entire Caribbean basin. Container ships arrive from Europe, from North America, from Asia. They are unloaded, sorted, and redistributed across the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Kingston is, quite literally, the logistical nerve center of Caribbean commerce. Ports are dual-use infrastructure. A deepwater commercial port operating normally in peacetime can serve very different functions under strategic pressure. Fuel bunkering, logistical staging, vessel access, communications infrastructure. The United States, which has used port access as a strategic tool throughout its own history, watches Chinese corporate involvement with Caribbean ports with real alertness, and that concern is a significant part of why American engagement with Jamaica has intensified over the last decade. Not through occupation, that era is over, through something quieter. There is a strategic concept the United States government uses for the Caribbean that most people outside foreign policy circles have never even heard of. It is called the third border. America has two land borders, and its third is maritime, formed by the arc of Caribbean island nations stretching between the mainland and open ocean. What happens inside that arc eventually reaches American shores. Drug flows, arms trafficking, migration pressure, hostile military positioning. None of it stays contained to where it starts. Through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, launched in 2010, the United States has channeled hundreds of millions of dollars into Caribbean security cooperation, maritime surveillance upgrades, law enforcement capacity building, intelligence sharing. Jamaica is one of the primary partners inside this framework. American law enforcement and intelligence agencies maintain active working relationships with their Jamaican counterparts, some publicly acknowledged, others simply understood. Jamaica's position relative to the Windward Passage makes it a natural node for maritime monitoring, vessel tracking, and regional signal collection, and this operates quietly, almost never announced in a press release, but fully understood by the professionals who manage these relationships day to day. The annual Tradewinds military exercises bring together armed forces from more than 20 Caribbean and Latin American nations, and Jamaica plays a prominent role in them. The Jamaica Defense Force has developed significantly over the past decade, acquiring maritime patrol capability and deepening its integration into regional security architecture with direct American support behind that growth. Jamaica is woven into American security infrastructure in ways that genuinely serve American strategic interests. That integration is mutually beneficial to a real degree, and it is also undeniably a form of managed dependency. The question worth sitting with is whether Jamaica manages that relationship on its own terms, or whether the terms are simply managed for it. There is a thread running through every chapter of this story, and it deserves to be said plainly. In 1940, Jamaica's geography was traded between two governments with zero Jamaican participation. In the 1970s, Jamaica's democratic choices were actively undermined by a foreign intelligence apparatus because those choices did not align with American Cold War strategy. A government the Jamaican people voted for was targeted with covert interference and documented weapons flows because it refused to subordinate Jamaican foreign policy to somebody else's requirements. In the 1980s, Jamaica was rewarded for political realignment, and that reward was real, and the conditions attached to it were equally real. This is not distant history. It is the operating logic of great power competition running right now in the present tense, using updated tools and updated actors. China has replaced the Soviet Union in this equation. Infrastructure loans have replaced military advisors. Security assistance has replaced covert operations. But the underlying strategic logic has not shifted by one single degree. Small nations sitting on large strategic value are always caught somewhere in the field of force between great powers. The only real question that matters is whether they understand that field clearly enough to navigate it on their own terms, instead of simply reacting to whoever is applying pressure that week. Here is the conversation that almost never happens in a Jamaican classroom or in a Jamaican political debate, and it might be the most important conversation this country can have. Jamaica's geography is a natural resource, every bit as real and valuable as a mineral deposit or a stretch of fertile farmland. It can be leveraged for genuine national benefit, or it can continue being leveraged by others without Jamaica capturing its fair share of the return. The difference between those two outcomes is awareness. The difference is strategy. Throughout the 20th century, Jamaica's geographic value was largely managed by external actors, while Jamaican governments spent most of their energy navigating pressure from more powerful players rather than shaping the terms of engagement from a position of strength. Jamaican leaders became excellent at domestic politics and far less practiced at geopolitics, and that gap has cost the country real leverage across generations. The 21st century offers something genuinely different. When two superpowers are actively competing for influence across the Caribbean, the nations both of them need suddenly gain more leverage than they had before, not less. Jamaica is exactly one of those nations. Small countries have pulled this off before. Singapore, a city-state with no meaningful natural resources of its own, hosts American military access while simultaneously building enormous trade relationships with China, and manages both without becoming captured by either. Qatar has made itself so indispensable to so many competing interests that no single power can afford to pressure it into picking a side. The pattern is consistent across every example. Strategic sophistication is what converts geographic position and relationship networks into durable, real national power. Jamaica already has the foundation for exactly this. The geography is already there, permanent and unmatched. The cultural capital is extraordinary, genuinely world-class. Reggae music carries UNESCO-recognized cultural heritage status. Bob Marley remains one of the most recognized human beings who has ever lived, a soft power asset with a reach that money alone cannot buy. Jamaican athletes have reshaped international track and field across 2 consecutive generations. The Jamaican brand carries a level of authenticity and global recognition that countries 50 times its size would envy and could never manufacture on their own. And then there is the diaspora, which functions as a genuine multiplier. Hundreds of thousands of Jamaicans living and working across the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada, sending remittances that rank among the most significant financial inflows into the Jamaican economy, building businesses, entering local politics, accumulating real professional influence inside the very countries competing for Jamaica's loyalty. A diaspora is never just an economic resource. It is geopolitical leverage in human form, and if you are watching this in London, in Toronto, in Brooklyn, in Miami, this is exactly where you fit into this story. You are not a bystander to Jamaica's geopolitical position. You are one of its assets, whether anyone in Kingston or Washington has told you that directly or not. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. A Jamaican professional in London sits inside the political and economic life of a country that once traded Jamaican land without asking. A Jamaican American in New York votes in a system that shapes the very foreign policy that decides how much pressure or investment Jamaica receives in a given decade. A Jamaican in Toronto builds wealth inside an economy that has its own separate and growing relationship with China. None of that is incidental. Every diaspora Jamaican carries a small piece of leverage that, on its own, looks modest, but multiplied across hundreds of thousands of people living inside the very nations competing for Jamaica's alignment, becomes something closer to a standing army of soft influence. Most of that leverage sits unused, not because it is small, but because nobody has ever organized it toward a shared strategic purpose. What Jamaica actually needs now is the capacity to convert all of these advantages into deliberate, sustained strategic leverage, rather than letting them sit dormant while other nations extract the benefit. The gap between what Jamaica has and what Jamaica actually pulls from what it has is one of the most consequential gaps in this country's entire story, and closing it is not a matter of luck. It is a matter of choice. Before we go any further, this is genuinely your moment. Drop your answer in the comments right now. What do you believe is Jamaica's single greatest strategic asset heading into the rest of this century? Is it the geography itself, the port of Kingston, the cultural brand built by generations of Jamaican artists and athletes, the diaspora spread across 3 major economies? Or is it the English language institutional heritage that opens doors across the Commonwealth and beyond? There is no wrong answer here, but this conversation matters, and the comment section is exactly where it belongs. The Windward Passage is busier today than at any point in its entire history. The Panama Canal's expansion, completed in 2016, effectively doubled the canal's capacity and pushed shipping volumes through Caribbean waters to new highs. More ships, larger ships, higher value cargo moving through the same narrow corridor Jamaica has watched over for centuries. The strategic importance of this passage has grown with global trade, not shrunk, and American naval doctrine has been revised repeatedly to reflect a great power competition that shows no sign of cooling down. So think back to where we started. A piece of paper signed in 1940, trading Jamaican land between 2 foreign governments without a single Jamaican in the room. Look at where we are now, in a moment where American security money and Chinese infrastructure loans are both flowing into the same small island, for reasons that have almost nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with a channel of water that has not moved an inch in 500 years. The pattern has never broken, not once, across a century of history. What can change, starting now, is who holds the pen the next time a deal like this gets drafted. Jamaica has spent 100 years being the asset in someone else's calculation. The geography, the culture, the diaspora, the moment in history where 2 superpowers both need what this island has. All of that is already in place. The only remaining variable is whether Jamaica chooses to write the terms itself, or whether it waits once again for someone else to write them first. If this video gave you a clearer picture of why this island matters more than its size on a map would ever suggest, subscribe to Caribbean Journey and help this channel reach 10,000 subscribers. Tell me in the comments which chapter of this story surprised you the most, the 1940 basis deal, the Manly years, or the China question happening right now, because that conversation is where the real understanding of this island's future actually begins.